Hello, everybody, online and in-house tonight. We're going to get started, and I think you'll really enjoy this presentation. This is on what I call fat or fiction. So we'll discuss the facts about fat and the fictions about fat and what's new in weight loss science. So let's start with this. What can we eat to stay healthy and thin? So what do you think about this picture here? You think this is good? These chicken wings, looks like fried with the skin on, all the benefits. We got some barbecue sauce here. I think we can all agree the French fries are out, right? Right. I mean, maybe a couple here and there, but basically they're out. And can we all agree that the salad's in? Yeah. Okay, salad's in. French fries are out. What about this stuff? Out, right. Barbecue sauces, ketchups. Unfortunately, I love to have a few French fries with my ketchup, as my daughter says, but when I'm being good, this stuff has a lot of high fructose corn syrup, a lot of sucrose and fructose, and as we'll learn, that's kind of one of the enemies here. How about this? Probably just fine. As you'll see, much of what we've been taught about saturated fat is completely wrong, and this stuff is going to be just fine for you. Now, there may be other reasons not to eat it that have to do with other specific issues you may have or toxins in some of these foods, but overall, these chicken wings are just fine. How about this beautiful breakfast? We've got the eggs, we've got the bacon. Can we all agree that half of a strawberry and a little piece of fruit's okay, right? Oh, you're allergic to it. Okay. Well, if you're not allergic to it, it's fine. How about the toast? No. No. Toast is out. Our home audience says toast is out. And it's true. Toast is mostly out, but like everything, in moderation. I'll tell you how many grams of carbohydrates you can have. But for the most part, this stuff's not good for you. How about this? Orange juice? No. No, right. Too much sugar. Too much sugar. And the reason it's too much sugar, because they take out the fiber and they take out the other nutrients. It's just the juice. This stuff is largely responsible for a lot of the obesity and diabetes we see in children, especially at the lower end of the economic scale, because they're on WIC and subsidies programs that give lots of juice to kids. It tastes good, but you can't drink the juice. How about eating an orange? Yeah. Fine. Yeah. Eating an orange is fine because of the fruit. The eggs are great, no problem, and the bacon is fine, no problem, as is this little piece of parsley. Okay, let's look at some of the fat or fiction quizzes. We get fat because we eat too much. Fat or fiction? True or false? Fiction. Fiction. Wow, that's a bold, the home audience is bold. Fiction. I'll explain why later. We get fat because we don't exercise enough. Fact or fiction? It's a tougher one. Yeah, it kind of seems to make sense that's one of the reasons, and there is some truth to it, but basically, fiction. For the most part, fiction. We don't get fat because we don't exercise enough. Okay, number 3 here. What determines whether we become fat or not? We're doing our little quiz. Fat or fiction? We get fat because of an imbalance in our hormones. Fact or fiction?
Does anybody can answer?
Anybody can answer.
I'm going to say hormones, yes, mess you up.
Yes. Hormones mess you up. That is a fact.
Yay.
In fact, it's the major fact, as you'll learn today. Okay, fact or fiction? Eating dietary fat makes you fat. We got one no.
Say yes.
Yeah, one yes. The answer is fiction. No, eating dietary fat does not make you fat. Okay, eating processed carbs makes you fat.
Yes.
Yes, yes. We've got the home audience says yes. Fat. It's a fat fact. Okay. The best way to regulate the hormones that make you fat is by eating the right foods. Fact or fiction?
Fiction.
Fiction. We have a split home audience. It is a fact. In fact, it is the major fact of this talk today that body fat and hunger are exquisitely regulated by hormones, enzymes, and the hypothalamus, a part of our brain, not by willpower or lack of exercise. And I'll give you an example. Try to use your willpower to stop your hair or your nails from growing. Pretty hard to do. Same is true of your body fat. You cannot use willpower to lose weight in the long term. Anybody can, white knuckle it through some. But we'll talk about why. So this is the foundational principle of weight gain. Body fat and hunger are exquisitely regulated by hormones, enzymes, and the hypothalamus, not by willpower or lack of exercise. So what are hormones in the body? We've talked about this a lot, but just think of them as compounds that instruct our body to do something. So for instance, to grow, growth hormone. To reproduce, we have sex hormones. To run, fight or flight hormones. To relax, we have parasympathetic relaxation hormones. So hormones tell our body what to do. So if you see someone with excess fat, it is a telltale sign that something has gone awry in the hormonal, enzymatic, or brain regulation of fat metabolism. It's not a sign of lack of willpower or laziness. And we'll prove this as the talk goes on. But for now, let me ask you a question. How carefully regulated is fat in the body? Exquisitely regulated. Because if we overeat by just 20 calories a day, which we're talking about 3 or 4 cashews, a bite of a piece of candy, nothing, right? If we overeat by 20 calories a day, it will transform us from lean in our 20s to obese in our 50s. Yes. So whatever makes us fatter, that is, whatever throws a wrench in the hormonal regulation of fat, will also make us overeat and or become sedentary in order to preserve energy. One of the key lessons is that fat is not a storage depot in the body. It is an endocrine organ. Fat is an exquisitely intelligent organ. It is a gland.
It's a gland. It's not a cell.
Fat. It's made up of cells, like all glands and all body tissues. It's made up of cells, but fat is considered an endocrine organ. It's like a thyroid or a pancreas. It's intelligent. It makes tons of hormones that feed back to the brain. Leptin, for instance. We'll learn a lot about leptin later. When your fat cells fill up, the fat makes a hormone called leptin that goes to the brain that says, hey, we're full, stop eating. Now we'll talk about all the things that disrupt the leptin signal, but the key is our fat is an organ. And just like trying to, make your nails grow or stop your hair from growing, stopping your fat cells from growing by, it doesn't work unless you control the hormones that regulate fat. Fat is highly regulated by hormones, enzymes, and brain function. The solution to being fat. Well, since body fat and hunger is exquisitely regulated by hormones, the solution is not eat less and exercise more. It is to adjust the hormones that regulate fat accumulation.
That's the total opposite
of everything I told you. When I advertised this talk, I said everything you think you know about weight loss is probably wrong. Now, I'll explain all this. So, but here's the clincher. The best way, we already learned this in Fact or Fiction, to change those hormones. There is no drug that can alter the hormones that regulate fat as well as a food. You have to look at food as a powerful medicine when it comes to fat metabolism and regulation. It is our choice of foods that regulates how hungry we're going to be, how active we can be, and how much we can control the hormones. I know you've got quizzical looks on your face. It will all make sense. Now, interestingly enough, it's been known since the 1930s that fat is continuously flowing in and out of fat cells, and what we call in the form of fatty acids. So our body relies on glucose for fuel and fatty acids. Those are the two main sources of fuel, and we're really designed to run perfectly well on fat. Fatty acids alone provide a high octane fuel for the body, and everything can run off fats. And this was confirmed in 1948 by Ernst Wertheimer, who was considered the father of the field of fat metabolism. So we've known about this information for a long time, and I'm going to give you some of the fascinating politics, what I call the Red Sea moment, when the scientific facts parted, if you will, from the advice that experts started giving us for all kinds of political and other reasons. But it's like a fascinating novel to me, what happened to us, and how for the last 40 years we were told low-fat diet is the key, and what did we create? An obesity and a diabetes epidemic. Oh, did someone? Oh, thank you. Okay, so what happens inside a fat cell? You can see here's a fat cell. This portion is triglyceride. These are fatty acids combined with a glycerol, a different molecule that comes from sugar, and these form big fat globules as we know them in the foods we eat, the meats and stuff like that.
Is that the good or the bad?
Which ones?
The triglycerides.
Triglycerides are,
You know, when we get the cholesterol.
yes, they're neither good nor bad, but high triglycerides definitely increase your risk for heart disease. That's a fact. You want low triglycerides. But it's different from the good and the bad cholesterol. Now we're not talking about cholesterol, just triglycerides, which is a storage form for fat. So fat flows in and out of cells as fatty acids. Little fatty acids are small enough to go in and out of the cells. Once they're inside the cell, 3 fatty acids are combined with a derivative of a sugar molecule called glycerol, and that forms a triglyceride. And triglycerides are a bigger molecule, so once they're inside the fat cell, they don't go out on their own. They need to be broken down into fatty acids inside the fat cell in order to escape. So we're going to talk about the fat trap. And this is the problem, is that these hormones that regulate fat cause fatty acids to go into the fat cell, and they're trapped there. And they make us fat, and we can't use the energy. So if we get tired, we have to eat more, and the hunger mechanism goes up, and we eat more because some of our calories were sequestered into the fat cells and trapped. We burn these fatty acids for fuel, and the primary determinant of whether fatty acids get stored as triglycerides or released into the bloodstream to be burned as energy, which keeps us thin, is the hormone insulin, right? What hormones regulate whether we become fat? Now, there are probably, I don't know, dozens at least, and maybe more than that, hormones that regulate fat at some level, either to the brain, hormones from the gut that tell the brain there's food in there, we're full, hormones from the fat like leptin. There's lots of different hormones and enzymes that regulate fat, but far and away the most important is insulin, and the second most important is leptin. So what is insulin? As everybody knows, type 1 diabetics don't make insulin. Their pancreas burns out from either a virus or genetics or whatever, and they cannot produce insulin. So they have a shortage of insulin, and insulin does a couple things. Insulin brings down your blood sugar. That's why diabetics have high blood sugar. They don't have the insulin to bring it down. But insulin is also the fat storage hormone. It does these three things. It makes you fat, it keeps you fat, and it makes you hungry. So when insulin levels are high, it makes you fat, it keeps you fat, and it makes you hungry. Always remember that. The best way to regulate insulin is by choosing the right foods. What foods keep insulin levels low? Low glycemic load foods. Because insulin goes up in response to blood sugar. That's its primary job. When the sugar in the bloodstream goes up, you eat a meal. Let's say you eat a candy bar. The sugar rushes into your bloodstream, the level in the blood goes up, the pancreas senses that, like a thermostat would sense, hey, it's too hot, click on the air conditioner. The pancreas senses, hey, there's too much blood sugar, click on the insulin pours out just like the air conditioning would, and it lowers the sugar in the bloodstream just like the air from the air conditioner cools the ambient temperature. So the pancreas causes insulin to go up in response to blood sugar. Now, the problem is that insulin is also a fat storage hormone. So when you eat a high sugar food or a processed carb, your insulin goes up very high, and that causes fatty acids to be stored in the fat cells. Okay? And no
for real sugar or fake?
Oh, well, real sugar. You mean like like NutraSweet and things? No, it's interesting. The artificial sweeteners do cause a rise in insulin, but even the anticipation of eating causes a rise in insulin because your body's preparing for food. But the jury's out on how bad the artificial sweeteners are for you. Probably not as bad as all that, but we just don't know, okay? But the key here is no drug can regulate insulin as well as food can. So what does insulin do? It works mainly through two enzymes in the body in terms of fat, LPL and HSL. LPL is called lipoprotein lipase, and this is an enzyme that forms on the outer surface of cells. And if it's on the outer surface of a fat cell, it literally grabs the fatty acids floating by from the fat in the meal you just ate, and it pulls them inside the fat cells where they are added to a glycerol molecule and form those triglycerides we saw up here that expand and make you fat, make us all fat, right? Simultaneously, insulin inhibits the enzyme called HSL, which stands for hormone-sensitive lipase. This is an enzyme found inside the fat cells. Remember I told you once this fat is constructed into triglycerides, the fatty acids, it can't be released. They're too big to go out. Excuse me. It's this hormone HSL, hormone-sensitive lipase, that is inside these fat cells that deconstructs the triglyceride into its fatty acids so they can be released from the cell and go out into the bloodstream and be burned for fuel. So that's how insulin works. What it does is it basically activates the LPL, lipoprotein lipase. Did I get that right? That sounds wrong. Yeah, lipoprotein lipase, so that fatty acids come into the cell and expand it, and it simultaneously inhibits the HSL inside here so it doesn't let the fat break down. That's insulin's job. It's to store fat, and it does it by increasing LPL to grab more fatty acids from the blood, and it inhibits the breakdown of fat so that you can store it. Yes, it seems like I know these things go into my suggestion box for God, right? When we get to...
Why would you attract the fat and then store it?
Yes, well, there are reasons from an evolutionary standpoint we'll talk about. So we go back here, and a little more about insulin. Insulin basically drives all nutrients into cells. So insulin is driving fatty acids into fat cells, but it's also driving amino acids into muscle cells so you can make more muscle. And it also drives glucose, sugar, into muscle cells so it can be used to give energy. And it also drives sugar into brain cells so we can think and stay clear. So insulin's important. It orchestrates, it drives all nutrients into cells and out of the bloodstream, and it orchestrates the storage of not just fat, but also protein and glucose. So insulin makes sure your muscles get enough amino acids to repair themselves. It makes sure your liver gets enough glucose to make glycogen, which is a storage form of glucose, so that it's like a candy bar that sits in your liver. So if your blood sugar goes too low because you haven't eaten in a while, then enzymes from your adrenal glands, cortisol, go to the liver, say, hey, release a little sugar, and it breaks down the glycogen into sugar, and your brain gets fuel very quickly. So, you know, it's like earthquake preparedness. You want a little supply readily available for, you know. Of course, we can deplete glycogen stores with about 30 to 45 minutes of exercise. That's why we say the first 30 minutes of exercise burns the carbs, burns the stored glucose. Then the 30 to 60 minute level, you really move into fat burning, because then you've got no more glycogen stores. You've got some in the muscle, but they're pretty much burnt up too. So then it goes to the fat cells and it starts to release them. So in that sense, I'm not saying exercise is bad. I'm just saying exercise does not, lack of exercise will not make you fat. It just does. You know, look, one Twinkie, you know, so you're talking whatever, 200 calories, that's about 30 minutes of pretty hard exercise just to burn that off. You can't exercise enough to eat whatever you want unless you're a competitive athlete or in training for some kind of movie where you know, they're paying you $1 million to lose 50 pounds. And, you know, I mean, if you're exercising 6 hours a day, you can pretty much eat anything for that period, but it's not a long-term solution. So now in 1965, Salomon Burson and Rosalind Yalow invented the technology to measure hormone levels in our blood. And Burson died, but Yalow, who lived on, actually won the Nobel Prize for this. But they said back in '65, insulin is the principal regulator of fat metabolism. So these are the guys that developed the ability to measure these hormones, which we really couldn't do accurately prior to this. So even back then, like I said, back in the 1930s we knew, and I'll give you some more evidence from the early years. It'd be amazing. So we see that reducing elevated insulin is the golden key to weight loss. And how do we get insulin down? There's two ways. You can either reduce the amount of insulin that's released into the blood, right, by the pancreas. So how do you reduce that? You avoid refined carbs and sugar, and you eat more fiber. So fiber, what does fiber do? When you eat fiber with a meal, it slows the absorption of sugar into the blood through the GI tract. And if the sugar goes up very slowly, that does not trigger the insulin to go high. If the sugar is absorbed very quickly, the pancreas gets the signal, says, hey, because high sugar is toxic to the blood. It damages proteins and something we call glycation, and it causes all kinds of problems. So the body doesn't want to see sugar too high. So insulin will come to the rescue. But if we eat foods that are absorbed slowly with lots of fiber and unrefined and unprocessed carbs, and that's why meats, that's why dietary fats do not make you fat, because dietary fat has no effect on insulin. It does not raise insulin levels, and protein very minimally raises insulin, not enough to be of a concern. You can eat as much protein and as much fat as you want. You'll never get fat. Okay, the other way to reduce insulin in the blood is to improve insulin sensitivity. In other words, make it so that a smaller amount of insulin gets the job done, so the body doesn't need more insulin. Okay? And how do we do that? Reducing insulin resistance by not eating fats and carbs together. Why do fats and carbs together create a problem? Because they cause fatty liver. When fats and carbohydrates are ingested at the same time, it goes to the liver, and if it's too much, it overloads the liver, and the liver cannot export all these fatty acids, and some of them start to form fat globules inside the liver, which increases insulin resistance. It means you need more insulin to get the job done. Think of it like this. I always give this analogy to patients. If you never drink alcohol, then if you have one beer, you're going to feel a little bit of a buzz. If you drink a couple beers every day, one beer is not going to do it for you anymore. The same thing happens with insulin. If insulin is running high all the time because you keep eating high carbohydrate foods, then the body loses its sensitivity to it. It's like almost insulin's crying wolf. It's just, insulin again. Just, we don't care. So what does the pancreas do? Because it knows it's got an important job. It puts out more insulin in response to the same sugar load. So you got the beginnings of what we call insulin resistance. And this is a problem because now we've got more insulin. So let's say one candy bar raises your insulin level to 20. But if you have insulin resistance, that one candy bar may raise your insulin to 40 because it has to get up here to bring the sugar down, because it's the cells become resistant. They don't respond to the insulin. Once that happens, then we already know the damaged insulin. It's going to make lots of LPL on the fat cells to bring those fatty acids in and store it, and it's going to completely inhibit that hormone-sensitive lipase inside the fat cell, so that fat never gets released.
So is that why diets like the Atkins diet that lets you have all kinds of meats and all kinds of fat that you would think would be horrible?
Yes, that's why the Atkins type diet is effective. And I'm not presenting the data today on the different diets, but the data is there on all of them. And Atkins is one of them that is among the highest for weight loss. There's no doubt about it. Now, we can argue there are other reasons to avoid, a lot of these fats because they have nitrates in them and other compounds that may be carcinogenic. And, I'm not saying, I think the South Beach and the Zone diet and some of those diets are more moderate. They say, look, stick with the lean meats and the leaner proteins. You can have bacon occasionally, not a problem. You can have some of the fattier meats, but try and tend towards, for other reasons, the healthier meats that don't, that don't have some of these other carcinogens in them. So let's go back to some of this early evidence, and we look at the fat trap, this ability for insulin to sequester calories away, and I'll explain it a little better to you. Julius Bauer, a physician from Vienna in the 1920s. Now we're thinking, right, like dinosaurs. Who knew anything in the 1920s? We didn't know anything, right? Wrong. In the 1920s, Dr. Bauer was a pioneer in endocrinology and genetics. And this was before, we didn't know much. We knew simple genetics of plants and insects and mosquitoes and how reproductive traits come and stuff like that. But really, he proposed that fat tissue in obesity is like a malignant tumor. Now, this is very interesting because what he's saying is that it grows without regard for the rest of the body. Because these fat cells steal or hijack calories while other organs and body tissues are starving for calories. Now, contrast this, Julius Bauer in 1920 with Dr. Barry Sears of Zone Diet fame in the 1980s started doing most of his work with the Zone, and in 2008 or 10 wrote a book called Toxic Fat, where he defined fat as a malignant tumor that can metastasize.
Wow.
So can you believe this? Like 90 years later.
Did you learn about this in medical school?
No, 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 no.
They
This
don't
is
even tell you
this is not taught in medical school. No, 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 no. So I'll tell you where I got most of this information. I'm going to introduce you to the books and the authors and some of them in a little bit. But Bauer said a sort of anarchy exists. The adipose tissue lives for itself. It does not fit into the precisely regulated management of the whole organism. Now, Bauer's idea was catching on at the Mayo Clinic in the late 1930s with a guy named Russell Wilder. The problem is at this time in Europe, almost all the research was being done in Europe. These guys were escaping war-torn Europe for their lives, and they were leaving their labs and leaving their work to escape, you know, Nazis and Hitler and the war. And what did our brilliant, narcissistic U.S. physicians do? Ignored their work. Some due to anti-German sentiment. They thought, hey, these guys are, you know, we know more than, you know how this goes, right? Okay, but it's not supposed to happen in science. Okay, politics is politics, but science is science. The problem is science is, there's a lot of politics, and we'll get into that. So what did the American scientists decide to do, and I'll get into this more? They decided to pursue obesity as a behavioral disorder rather than a hormonal disorder. Lack of willpower, lazy, don't exercise enough, glutton, eat too much, right? Okay, let's look at Stephen Ranson in the 1930s, a neuroanatomist from Northwestern who showed that destroying parts of a rat's hypothalamus caused the rodents to eat voraciously and become obese. He noted that after their surgery, their fat tissue sucked up calories, causing an increase in body fat. These calories were literally stolen or sequestered into the fat cells, and their energy, because remember, a ton of energy comes from fat. Because when we've got enough energy, the brain gets the message and says, hey, I'm full, I'm fine. This was the remarkable thing about fen-phen. When fen-phen was out, 15 years ago, it was the first combination of drugs that literally changed people's lives. Unfortunately, it killed a few too many from side effects. However, what you heard again and again from patients was, it's completely chemical. I could never stop eating those Girl Scout cookies. But when you're on fen-phen, you eat a couple, the signal that you're full came, satiety hit, you stopped eating. It wasn't willpower. Completely satisfied, completely. Patients would say this again and again. It was chemical. So, and in fact, we understand that it is. Now, remember the fundamental law of weight loss, right? Body fat and hunger are exquisitely regulated by hormones, insulin, enzymes, lipoprotein lipase, hormone-sensitive lipase on the fat cells, and the hypothalamus, brain. So this one, Julius Bauer, I don't think he addressed any specific one, but here Ranson's addressing the hypothalamic, the brain level, right? Now, because the hormone, remember, insulin goes up. When the fat gets into the cells and they're full, the fat cells should release something called leptin. Leptin goes to the hypothalamus. I'll teach you all about the pathway it does that, why. And the hypothalamus sends the signal, says, we are full, stop. No more hunger. It's a signal that those of us who struggle with weight hardly ever feel. Right, yeah. Right. So we'll, now, interestingly enough, one of the authors of one of the books I'll tell you about, Robert Lustig, Dr. Lustig is a pediatric endocrinologist. He got his start. He wrote a book called Fat Chance. He learned about all this and got his start by studying young kids with brain tumors that had to be irradiated that destroyed their hypothalamus, and so they were now brain resistant to leptin. They had all the receptors in the brain for leptin were gone. Those kids grew morbidly obese after their surgery or after their radiation for their brain tumors. So we definitely see the hypothalamic level definitely has a lot to do with it. So, so what he found is that these calories are sequestered away. This leaves insufficient fuel for the body. He called it a hidden semicellular starvation, forcing one of two things to happen. The body either increases its food intake, gluttony, right, or it cuts down its expenditure, lack of exercise, so-called sloth, gluttony or sloth, but what's the primary problem here? It's not laziness or eating too much. It's
not getting that signal.
It's not this. The hormone signals are.
So either there's something wrong on the receiving end or on the sending end. So you don't know if it's a leptin, or too little leptin, or if something up here is not.
Correct. That's very good. The question was, do we know whether it's too little leptin or the brain's not responding to leptin, like certainly in damage from surgery or radiation? Well, unfortunately, there was a lot of excitement about leptin when it was first discovered. I can't remember the year. I think the 90s. And drug companies invested millions and millions of dollars before they had any research in, but they quickly got into trouble because it turns out that most of us have a lot of leptin, but there's leptin resistance.
So
the brain doesn't respond to the leptin. So giving leptin to overweight people doesn't do a thing. Most overweight people. Now, if it's leptin, if you're one of the, I think there's 12 people in the world that have leptin deficiency.
So I can count on that?
Yeah, if you're one of the 12, you're in good luck. Okay, and what's the other issue is that certain types of rats that are bred to be fat, these so-called Zucker rats, actually steal calories from vital muscles and organs to feed the fat cells. So it's not even as bad as the food you eat. It's like this lipoprotein lipase on the fat cells wants food, and it'll actually cause the body to start digesting its own muscles and vital organs to get that energy. Okay. Now, let's talk about the 1970s. We'll move forward, 40 years. Gary Wade's oophorectomized rats. That means we remove the ovaries from these female rats. Research at the University of Massachusetts. Experiment number 1. Wade removes the ovaries from female rats, and they begin to eat voraciously, quickly becoming obese. Observation number 1. When rats eat too much, they become obese, i.e. gluttony causes obesity. Gary Wade's oophorectomized rats, part 2. Experiment number 2, Wade removes the ovaries from another group of female rats, but this time he puts them on a strict post-surgical diet, doesn't let them eat any more than they ate before. What do you think happens? They get enormously fat again. They eat everything they're allowed, which is a limited amount, and they become excessively sedentary. They don't move unless you put food in front of them. Okay?
I bet they're in a really bad mood.
These rats, yeah, a really bad mood, ravenously hungry because they weren't allowed to eat any more food. Then they had eaten before the surgery, but they got just as obese. It'll make sense in a minute. Just as quickly as the rats that were allowed to eat as much as they wanted. But these rats also become completely sedentary. Observation number 2, when rats become sedentary, they become obese. So laziness causes obesity. So you see where these myths came from, right? Eating too much in the first group, right? You remove them and they eat voracious. Oh, they're just pigs. They just don't have any self-control. They become fat. They're just lazy, right? But we already know what happens with hormone dysregulation. So now I'm going to tell you, why does low estrogen lead to the fat storage? We talked about insulin doing it. In this case, in rats, insulin also has an effect in rats, but estrogen has a really big effect. And it does in humans too, but I'll show you. So if you combine experiment number 1 with experiment number 2, we have to come to completely different conclusions. Removing the ovaries causes a decrease in estrogen. This causes the fat tissue to absorb extra calories from fatty acids in the bloodstream. Because, I'll explain it in a minute, but we already learned about lipoprotein lipase, LPL, on the surface of fat cells. Well, it turns out when you have a deficiency of estrogen, LPL is increased. The cells increase LPL on the fat cells so it can pull more fatty acids from the blood and glucose and make more fat in the fat cells. So if the rat can eat more, it will, in order to have the energy to move. If the rat can eat more, it will expend less energy. But either way, even the calories it would eat normally all go to fat. They're all sequestered and stolen into the fat. And here's the picture from Gary Taub's book called Why We Get Fat. And you see here, in a case of low estrogen, it upregulates, which means causes the nucleus of the cell to make more of this enzyme LPL and bring it to the surface. Once it's at the surface, it literally grabs the fat and pulls it into the cell. Now, once you restore estrogen, the LPL levels go down and less fat gets into the cells. So high estrogen downregulates or decreases the amount of LPL. Low estrogen increases, or what we call in medicine, upregulates the amount of LDL. It makes more. So,
put that on your list for God and the suggestion.
yes, another
oversight there.
Exactly. So this is the fat trap. Hormonal disruption of fat metabolism. Remember, we said hormones, brain, or enzymes. So the animal doesn't get fat because it overeats. It overeats because it gets fat, because the fat steals all the calories. It has no energy. And the brain craves glucose and energy. And if it doesn't have it, it'll force you to eat. I mean, this is basic evolution, survival, hunger, reward. I mean, it hits all those mechanisms. So the primary problem is a defect in the regulation of fat metabolism, caused here in these rats by a lack of estrogen, certainly in humans caused by some lack of estrogen, some lack of testosterone, and an increase primarily in insulin. Insulin is magnitudes of order more important than estrogen and testosterone, but they're all important. So Dr. Barry Sears calls this the fat trap in his book. In other words, the defect in fat metabolism leads these fat cells to steal fatty acids and store them away where they cannot be used for energy. So I give this analogy. It's like depositing $100 into the ATM, but only $50 ends up in your account. You're eating all this food, but you're like, I'm still struggling. I mean, I got no financial security here. I got no energy security. I'm eating, but somebody's siphoning off everything I'm earning, or So think of this. You eat 1,000 calories, but the first 500 of them goes into the fat cells and makes you fat. Remember the rats? Even when they couldn't eat, all they could eat was what they eat before. What's different? The LPL is so upregulated. There's so much LPL on the surface of the fat cells that even the calories they ate before that went to fuel the muscles, the organs, the brain, now goes directly to the fat cells, and it leaves no energy for them. So you eat it, but you only 500 calories of energy to move about and run metabolic processes is left. So either way you get fat, because the first 500 go to the fat cells, but if you want to be active, you've got to eat more, or you stop moving because you don't have enough energy left. And so you eat 500 more calories, and this time 250 go to the fat cells. So either way, you're getting robbed again and again and again and again. Okay, the hormonal proof in the pudding. So Wade did one more experiment. He removed the ovaries from another group, and this time he infused estrogen back into them through the bloodstream. What happened? They did not get fat, they did not eat voraciously, and they did not become sedentary. In other words, they acted like perfectly normal rats. Hormone replacement. Now remember, in this case, it's a lack of estrogen and testosterone that cause too much LPL. With insulin, it's the reverse. It's too much insulin that causes the LPL. But remember, here we are back to the foundational principle of weight gain. Body fat and hunger are exquisitely regulated by hormones, insulin, estrogen, testosterone, enzymes, LPL, and hormone-sensitive lipase, HSL, and the hypothalamus brain. Remember, damaged brains in the rats, 1930 by Ranson. Boom, eating like crazy because they're not getting the feedback that we're full. So here's the paradoxical facts of weight gain. We don't get fat because we eat too much. We eat too much because we get fat. We don't get fat because we don't exercise enough. We don't exercise enough because we get fat. Gluttony and sloth do not cause us to become fat. They are the result of our becoming fat. Pretty amazing, huh?
Yeah.
I was shocked when yeah. So what went wrong with our expert doctors in the 70s and 80s? Well, a lot of things went wrong in the 70s. I happened to grow up during that period. It was, as some have called it, the age of stupidity. My friend Dennis Prager calls it that. So what happened is the scientists decided in the 1970s, against remarkable amounts of scientific evidence, of which I've given you a taste back to Dr. Bauer in Vienna in the 1920s and these experiments, that the problem with obesity was behavioral. And it had to do with not exercising and not having the willpower to eat less. What a terrible mistake. So Gary Taubes, the author of What Makes Us Fat, posed a great question when I read his book. If the subject had been about why some kids grow to 6 feet tall and others only grow 5 feet tall, no scientist would have been looking at behavioral issues, right? They would have been looking at hormones and enzymes that regulate growth. But somehow this idea that fat has to do with, oh, you're just lazy, you're, have no willpower. I mean, it's this horrible prejudice, or I don't even know where it originally came from, but there it is.
But there's this whole movement now, currently, about young children being obese. It's an epidemic.
It is an epidemic because of the decisions we made in 1970 and 1980s to institute low-fat diets. Why? Because low-fat, and I'll tell you why we went that way, but low-fat diets taste terrible. Nobody sticks to them unless you add sugar and carbs. And so we increased insulin levels for 30 years, and we have an obesity epidemic. What a surprise. Okay, more expert advice ignored. Let me take you back to 1901. William Osler, considered the father of modern medicine, wrote the textbook at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, The Principles and Practice of Medicine. He's famous for a quote I used to love. He said, "It's more important to know what sort of patient has the disease than what sort of disease the patient has." He knew back then. He understood people. He understood genetic variability, unique personalities, how it all combines to create disease. It's not just a microbe that causes pneumonia. It's the person's resistance and their sense of, so he really understood mind-body medicine. But even back in 1901, he advised obese women to avoid taking too much food and particularly to reduce the starches and sugars. 1901. Now, from 1943 to 1952, Taubes summarizes findings from physicians from Stanford, Harvard, Chicago Children's Memorial Hospital, Cornell, New York Hospital. Independently, all these prestigious universities published their diets for treating obese patients. And all were independently published, but all were effectively identical. 1943 to 1952, no sugar, no candy, no cake, no cookies, no flour, no potatoes. It's humbling, isn't it, to see this? Another physician came from, I think, Germany or Europe. Hilde Bruch recounted this history in 1957. Then she was a leading physician treating obesity at the time. And she reviewed at her point in the 50s, you know, the 50 years prior. The great progress in dietary control of obesity. And since she was from Europe, she had no bias against these physicians that we ignored, right? She said, the greatest progress in dietary control of obesity was the recognition that meat, considered the strong food, was not fat-producing. She wrote, but that it was innocent foodstuffs, such as bread and sweets, which lead to obesity. Well, I don't, you know, you almost have to be just, but I'll explain to you what happened. What happened was what we call the macronutrient wars between 1970 and 1980. This could be a movie. I mean, this could be a major drama in what led us astray for the last 40 years. There were two key players. One, a guy named Ansel Keys, I think from Minnesota, somewhere in the Midwest, who wrote what's called the 7 Countries Study. And the other, John Yudkin, who was a European physician, I think European, and his book called Pure, White, and Deadly. Guess what that refers to? Not cocaine, but sugar. So what Ansel Keys did was do these big epidemiological studies. And in those days, you had to travel. The internet wasn't around. I mean, you went to these countries. You examined the records. You went to the libraries. And he examined over 20 countries. He published a study called the 7 Countries Studies and found these 7 countries that dietary fat correlated almost linearly, 1-for-1, with increased risk of heart disease. Now, dietary sugars did too, because where diets are high in fats, they're also high in sugars. But he never controlled for it in his statistical analysis. He said, yeah, it could be that, but it's not. I mean, basically, he dismissed it. Now, the other thing he did to mislead us, and many of the politicians at the time, was Ansel Keys did not include the other 13 countries because the data didn't fit. He used the 7 countries that fit his theory because he was on a mission to become who knows what. You know, and this is a major problem of ego, and I don't know the guy. I mean, maybe he was a gentleman and just misguided. He clearly wasn't honest. Honesty was not a top priority because, you know, you don't just leave out data that goes against what you want to promote. You have to give the facts and then, you know, make the conclusions. But he didn't give all the facts, and we found it out later. So, however, John Yudkin turned out in his book in which he wrote, I think, either in the early 70s or whatever. I just ordered this book from Amazon. It just got republished. But Dr. Lustig, who talks about it, says that virtually everything in this book was prophetic. I mean, it just came true. And so, unfortunately, in the macronutrient wars, macronutrients refer to fat, carbs, and proteins. Ansel Keys won out, and the political establishment, you know, the government got on board, the USDA, low-fat diet, low-fat diet, low-fat diet, low-fat diet. Okay, there's more bad news. So this was the Red Sea moment. I told you about this before. I made this up. What's the Red Sea moment? Because you know, Passover just went, and Moses went right through the Red Sea. So I'm thinking about this, and what parted here was not the Red Sea, but the truth. And what parted was expert opinion parted from scientific facts. This is always dangerous. My, you know, virtual mentor, Prager, always says on his show, first give the facts, then give your opinion. And when you don't do this, it's very dangerous. So we should all take this advice in every part of our lives. Someone is allowed to have their opinion, but let's agree on the facts, okay? So in 1984, what we were told about saturated fat, what we were told was it's a killer, actually parted ways with the scientific evidence about saturated fat. And what was the scientific evidence? That reducing it in the diet does not reduce heart attacks. Let me tell you about the 2 key studies, 1 and 2, that happened right here. The NHLBI, National Heart, Blood, Lung, and Blood Institute of the United States government, had spent $115 million on a very famous trial in 1982 when the results were published called the Mr. Fit trial, the multiple risk factor something trial. Decade-long clinical trial, lots of money, and they were testing the idea that eating less saturated fat would curb heart disease, but not a single heart attack was prevented. That's fact number one.
Pretty big.
Pretty big. Hard to ignore that fact, don't you think? Relationship between saturated fat, eating saturated fat, a low saturated fat diet does not prevent a single heart attack. All right, what's fact number two? The Institute had also spent $150 million testing the benefits of a new cholesterol-lowering drug. This trial was called the Lipid Research Clinics Coronary Primary Prevention Trial, LRC-CPPT. They used this drug cholestyramine, which it actually binds. It's a bile acid binder. So it goes in the gut and it binds with cholesterol and takes it out through the stool so it doesn't get reabsorbed, and it lowers cholesterol. So what they did was they tested this drug, and they found that it lowers LDL, it lowers cholesterol in high-risk men, and it reduced morbidity and mortality from heart disease. So it sounds pretty impressive. That drug reduced morbidity and mortality for patients at high risk from heart disease. And it lowered LDL cholesterol. It lowered the bad cholesterol.
Differently than a statin would?
Differently than statins do. Now, what's the leap of faith? The leap of faith is that just because cholestyramine lowers LDL and it reduces the risk of heart attack, you can't assume that it reduces the risk of heart attack just because it reduced the LDL. Maybe it does a bunch of other things. I'm going to explain this better to you. Here's a great example from Gary Taub's book. We know that aspirin reduces heart disease. It reduces inflammation, reduces heart disease. We know that aspirin reduces headaches. We don't jump to the conclusion that aspirin reduces heart disease because it reduces headaches. Right? It makes perfect sense when you think of it. They're just two associations. Cholestyramine lowers LDL, and cholestyramine reduces the risk of heart disease in men. But it's a giant leap of faith to say that it does it because it reduces the LDL. Just like it's a giant leap of faith to say that aspirin reduces heart disease because it reduces headaches. You would have to test that. You would have to give aspirin and see for the people that it didn't reduce headaches, did it also reduce heart disease? You can't jump to that conclusion. It's just faulty logic. So what are the facts? The facts are cholestyramine reduces LDL. And another fact is cholestyramine reduces the risk of heart attack in high-risk men. What are the other facts? Reducing dietary fats. Now, I didn't tell you this yet, but reducing dietary fats does lower LDL, but it does not reduce heart attacks. Okay? So what they decided to do was say, well, we have this study that says lowering saturated fat does not reduce a single heart attack. It does reduce LDL by a small percent, 2%. Okay? So it does reduce LDL, but it doesn't reduce heart attacks. We also have this study that says we have a cholesterol-lowering drug that reduces LDL cholesterol and it reduces heart disease. So what did the scientists do?
They did more of this drug.
Yeah, they ignored the fact that saturated fats lowering saturated fats doesn't reduce heart attacks, and they went instead and say, well, look, if this drug reduced the risk of heart disease, reduced heart disease in men, and it lowered LDL, then let's assume because this saturated fat does lower LDL, I should put that in there, would curb heart disease. Where'd that go? Sorry.
Maybe you just weren't getting enough. Maybe it didn't reduce it enough. And by giving the actual drug, it
Yeah,
gives it enough.
right. No, there are other reasons. I'll get into them now. No, it just turned out. But what they decided to do was basically ignore this $115 million study and go with this one. And then they just said, well, since this drug reduced the risk of heart attack in men, and since it lowered LDL, and since we know that lowering saturated fats reduces LDL, let's just say that everybody should be on drugs and a low-fat diet. At the ignoring of a decade-long $115 million trial that said, sorry, lowering saturated fats, even though it lowers LDL a small bit, does not lower the risk of heart attack. So you can see what a disaster this was. And in all fairness, wasn't easy to figure out because not all the information that we know now was in, but it was a big leap of faith. And even scientists at the time, and then when you see the number of deaths that this reduced, it was minuscule. It was really small. It was, I think this study had, 3,800 men in it, and on the treatment arm, something like 50 died, and on the non-treatment, something like 68 died. I mean, in total, it turned out to be a very small percentage, and many scientists that disagreed with the conclusion said, this is hardly the conclusive evidence that it was published to be. But, people don't want to think. We just want somebody to tell us what to do. So then the government took over. Ansel Keys won the macronutrient war, and we ended up with basically a disaster of diabetes and obesity. So here in summary, the faulty logic: dietary fat increases LDL. LDL increases the risk of coronary artery disease. We know that. That's true. Therefore, dietary fat increases the risk of coronary artery disease. But that's not right, because just because A causes B and B causes C doesn't mean A causes C. In mathematics, all you can say is that no A, therefore no C, therefore no A. You can say the contrapositive is true, but you can't say that one leads to the other. Why? Because dietary fat does much more than just increase LDL. It's true. Dietary fat increased LDL by 2%. 2%. But it also changed the particle size of LDL from small and dense, which is the dangerous kind, to large and buoyant, which is the non-dangerous kind. So you see, if you jump to it, you can't jump to a conclusion, because dietary fat does more than increase LDL. It does increase LDL, but it also changes it from the very dangerous type of LDL to the neutral, non-dangerous type of LDL. This is why lowering dietary fat didn't do a thing to reduce heart disease. This is why you can have your bacon and your sausage and your chicken wings and your steak with fat in it. Please still some moderation in case there's something else we don't know. But now, what else does dietary fat do? What else does saturated fat do? It causes a 30% decrease in triglycerides. And that drastically reduces the risk of heart disease. Excuse me.
That
So,
causes the triglycerides to go down.
Absolutely. Saturated fats and dietary fat reduces triglycerides dramatically. Carbohydrates raise triglycerides dramatically. We've known that for many, many years. If you have high triglycerides, it is a problem of too many carbs.
So it's better to eat a pound of steak than 2 slices.
It's better to eat a pound of steak than 2 slices of bread. That's a nice, simple, thank you, Chuck. That's a nice, simple conclusion. Unquestionably, it's a fact. Okay. So let me explain this LDL thing, what I talked about here, the small, dense, and the large buoyant. Because just when you thought it can't get any crazier, LDL is, excuse me, the bad cholesterol, right? But it turns out there's a good bad cholesterol and there's a bad cholesterol. So the good bad cholesterol is a large buoyant LDL particle, does not cause heart disease. The bad LDL is small and dense. Excuse me for a minute. Thank you. Okay, we're back on. Sorry, I had the cough. I got a little tickle in my throat, talking too much. So, 80% of blood LDL is large and buoyant and neutral of the bad cholesterol. But the small dense is implicated in atherosclerotic plaque formation. So dietary fats do increase the bad cholesterol, but they increase the neutral bad. So it does not increase your cardiovascular risk. In fact, saturated fats have been exonerated from playing a role in the atherosclerotic process. Now, I bet if you ask that question to 100 people, 99 would say, oh my God, they're horrible for you. So we got a lot of educating to do. Now, one other study showed this to be true. Now, what's the other study that showed this? In the 90s, in Boston, they started the Women's Health Initiative study. I think this was a study mostly of nurses. 50,000 women. Now, they did this study partly out of pressure because they had studied these things in men, and they wanted to make sure that they applied to women, right? So they took half of the 50,000 women, gave them a 30% low-fat diet for 7 to 8 years, and guess what? Their LDL went down. Okay, we know that's true. But guess what else? It had no effect on lowering their risk of heart disease or stroke.
They weren't enjoying their 7 to 8 years of life.
Yeah, and they didn't get to enjoy that juicy steak. Okay, fat or fiction. A low-fat diet is detrimental to your health. Fact or fiction?
It won't help you lose weight, but I don't know that it's dangerous. Oh, gosh.
It is dangerous.
You're just
Well,
doing this to make
I'm doing this to mess with you a little, but it is. Why? Because it tastes bad.
But that's not bad for your health.
Yeah, that's bad for your emotional health.
Okay.
I just threw that in. And because it tastes bad, they have to add what we talked about, sugar and salt and all kinds of bad processed carbs. So it raises insulin, which creates inflammation and causes weight gain. It also increases the bad LDL, which does raise your risk of heart disease, and fatty acids are essential to life. You've never heard of you heard of essential amino acids. You need to eat a certain amount of protein. Your body can't make them. You've heard of essential fats. We need fats. We have to eat fat or we would die. Fats are essential to life. But there's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. Nobody has ever proven that if without a carbohydrate, you would die.
I could. I
know,
would die.
you might feel like you would. Okay, a high saturated fat diet increases the amount of small, dense LDL, the bad LDL, in your body. True or false? High saturated fat. Does it increase the really bad stuff or no? No. Fiction. False. Eating more saturated fat actually increases the large buoyant LDL, which is the non-heart disease forming type, and small dense LDL is increased by eating high carbohydrate diet. All right, so what do dietary fats do? Remember I told you they're high octane fuel. They give your body a lot of energy. Eating fat does not make you fat. Fats alone do not elevate insulin levels. Fats and carbohydrates together, however, a different story. Now, you can eat some carbohydrates, but you have to limit it, and I'll tell you how much. What do dietary proteins do? Proteins trigger glucagon release. This is another hormone that basically causes the liver to release sugar and pumps glucose into the bloodstream, but it stops the hunger signal, turns off insulin release. So glucagon's good. When you eat protein, why we like high protein meals, you know, it turns off the hunger signal. Stimulates glucagon, which lowers the insulin. What do dietary carbohydrates do? I know, you just look at this and you're like, I love that. Bread and butter, fats and carbs, the worst combination.
Butter.
Yeah, eat the butter, leave the bread alone. Eat less bread and more butter. Stir fry your veggies in butter. Certain carbs like the veggies, the greens, fine. You know, you can eat all the butter you want on that. Those don't really count as carbs because they're not processed carbs. They don't raise sugar much, and I'll go into that. What do carbohydrates do? They trigger insulin release. Insulin drives fat storage and lowers blood sugar. Carbohydrates make you fat. All carbs break down into glucose. Muscle cells store glucose as glycogen, a storage form. So if you can't eat and a tiger decides to chase you, you have some immediate energy available to run. Backup generator. Liver cells store glucose as glycogen. Again, you need it to fuel your brain during sleep. When you're not eating, your blood sugar drops. So the liver can release some glycogen, the brain tells it to, and it gets plenty of fuel. Fat cells store glucose as triglycerides, which makes you fat. Carbohydrates drive insulin, which drives fat. I mean, we could end the talk like that and say goodbye, the rest is commentary, you know. All right, processed or refined, which means remove the fiber, basically, right? Yeah. Versus natural carbohydrates, with some exception. But natural carbs, we all understand these, fruits, veggies. You know, some of these carbs, like carrots, have a little higher glycemic index, but you'd have to eat a ton of them to really, so, I mean, it's pretty unlimited. You could, corn's not on here, and peas, again, kind of a high glycemic load, but again, for the amount we're going to eat, put the butter on the corn, enjoy yourself. Not going to be a big deal. Okay? Now, put the butter on the corn, have 4 slices of garlic bread and the big fat steak, trouble. Have the big fat steak, have half a thing of corn with some butter and a salad and some veggies or a slice of bread. But you can't have...
all the flour things.
Yeah, everything in here has the fiber removed. Now, some would argue that if you eat a high-fiber bread, pumpernickel has a much lower glycemic index than white bread or French bread up here. All these things have had the bran and the fiber removed because it increases shelf life, it increases portability, exportability, storage, transportation, all the things that make things go bad, you know.
How about those like living 7 sprout breads or whatever, like at like a Mother's Market?
Yeah, much better, much better.
But still not.
Well, you have to limit your carbs. I'll tell you how much you have to limit it
Before
to.
you leave this slide, you've got there pasta, white. What about wild rice, red rice?
Yeah, wild rice, a little bit better. Brown rice, a little bit better. You've got to look at the makeup and see how much fiber is in it. If there's a lot of fiber in it, then that reduces the risk. I should have put up a food label thing. I took it out. But let's say, for example, 1 serving of a carbohydrate. Let's take a cup of rice. A cup of white rice has about 45 grams of carbohydrates. And no fiber. Let's say they found a process where they could make 45 grams of carbs and put 20 grams of fiber in a cup of white rice, okay? High fiber white rice. Then your net carbs is 45 minus 20. So that now will only raise your blood sugar as if it were 25 grams. That's how it works.
You subtract the fiber.
You subtract the fiber from the total carbs, and you get what's called net carbs. And net carbs that you're allowed, which I'll go into a minute, probably somewhere about 75 to 100 grams a day. Now, a slice of bread is 25, on average, grams of carbs. So theoretically, you could eat 4 slices of bread a day. Now, it depends on your total calories, but it's more than you think. But if you have a piece of fruit, that's about 25 grams of carbs. So you probably should only have 3 pieces of bread if you're going to eat fruit. Okay?
Bananas are very high.
Bananas are very high in sugar. This is one of the highest glycemic index foods. And again, if you counted in your allowable carbs, it's fine. Probably going to, well, I think a small banana is going to be about 25, but you're probably closer to 45 on the bananas we get. So again, you can use it. Now, the difference is bananas do have some fiber. They do have moisture. They don't absorb as quickly as, pure table sugar or high fructose corn syrup or a soda. But you do have to watch the bananas. You do have to watch the peas, the corn, and the carrots, and the grapes. But you don't have
and
to.
the watermelon and the cantaloupe, because then you're going to wipe me out.
Yeah.
I like all those.
Well, you can eat all those things, but count your carb grams. Stay under 100. Stay under 100. Find out what serving size you're eating of the cantaloupe and stay under 100. I mean, total for the day, Why? Bad carbs, because they cause a rapid and large increase in blood sugar, which, remember, leads to the rapid rise in the insulin level, which then causes all the fat storage, sequestration, fat trap, everything to go into play. Now, there's the fruits that we talked about: bananas, grapes, watermelon, some veggies like corn, potatoes, and peas. Yeah, potatoes are rough. They're on the kind of like, look, your safest bet on veggies, the green leafies, the green veggies, obviously onions, kale, broccoli, cauliflower, asparagus, all these things are great. And especially now that you can stir fry them with some butter, coconut oil if you want. I have a patient who loves coconut oil, and that's a great oil for you. Also, coconut oil has medium chain triglycerides in it, which help increase fat burn. So look, I never think of it much, but I love like fresh string beans stir fried with butter, add a little salt. They're delicious. They're filling, and it's pretty much a free food. As long as you're not eating the carbs. I mean, going over with these carbs.
Better than baking or...
Well, no, you can bake those things and they taste pretty good too. I remember this movie with Queen Latifah and that Gerard Depardieu. I forget what it's called. Queen Latifah thought she was dying of some cancer, and she went to this great, fabulous spa and ate like a queen and hit it off with the chef who was Gerard, And anyway, he comes up to her at one point in the movie, and he sees how happy she is, and and all these other people are like, they're really wealthy. She's spending her last dime to live this fantasy her last few weeks, right? And Gerard comes up to her and he says, "I see you've discovered the secret of life." And she goes, "What's that?" He goes, "Butter." Okay, the Fat Masters. These are the guys to learn from. Dr. Barry Sears. Interesting history. I've met Barry Sears. He's an amazing guy. Toxic Fat was his latest book, Anti-Inflammation Zone. My next talk, I'll go into a little more detail of some of his approach, because there's some other reasons and things about fish oil that we'll teach you about that tie in with the fats and insulin and stuff like that. But he puts it all together. His father died of a massive heart attack at age 53. His 3 brothers also died within several years. So he really had a vested interest, and he started investigating all kinds of things. So anyway, he's a great man, and he has a great colleague here. Me and him together at my last conference, and I'm inflammation zone certified.
Wow.
Yeah. So I went to his talk and nabbed a picture beforehand. All right, this is the guy who started it all for me. One of my patients recommended this book, guy named Vinny, great book, Why We Get Fat. This guy summarizes the whole thing. If you want to really understand it and get some of the, you know, the drama that went on politically, I mean, he's a great writer. He's actually a science writer for Science Magazine, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation investigator, UC Berkeley, brilliant guy. And he wrote another book called Good Calories, Bad Calories, which is like the 700-page version that he shortened up so normal people could read this one. And then this is the other guy I spoke about, Dr. Lustig, professor of pediatric endocrinology, UC San Francisco, obviously a scientist of great credit here, 85 peer-reviewed articles. It is not easy to get a peer-reviewed article published, 30 reviews, and he was the one that started working on the children with cancer who had, at St. Jude's Medical Center, who had either radiation or surgery that destroyed their hypothalamus and they couldn't read the signals, etc. So I tell you what, let's pick it up next time. I think that's a lot of information. I'm going to go into a little bit more of some of the insulin-leptin connection and the brain connection. We'll go into a little bit of the functions of fatty acids, and we'll go into what you can eat. Well, actually, let's talk about this because this is important. Foods to be avoided. If we summarize this 1951 textbook before we got so smart that we ignored the evidence and the Red Sea moment, what do you avoid? Well, bread and everything else made with flour. Cereals, including breakfast cereals and milk puddings. Potatoes and all other white root vegetables. I don't know what's another white root vegetable? What? Turnips. Okay, well, turnips and parsnips. I am in the presence of brilliance. Thank you. Or a farmer. Foods containing much sugar and all sweets. Well, look, that's maybe a little extreme. We don't have to avoid everything, but we do need to moderate it. What can you eat as much as you like of? This is 1951, guys. Meat, fish, birds. Cook them first.
Poultry.
Yeah, poultry.
Yeah.
In 51, they were just birds.
Right.
All green vegetables. Eggs, dried or fresh. Listen, all the studies on good breakfast, cheese omelet. Can't go wrong. Eat the cheese, eat the omelet, scramble some, dice some. No, saturate, eat the egg. No, you can eat the yolk. The yolks are saturated fat. Eat the yolk. Please eat the yolk. If you want to lose weight, eat the yolk, eat the cheese, eat the cheese. It is the best part. Eat the onions, stir fry it with butter, and don't eat the bread.
You don't want to know what I had for breakfast on Jenny Craig this morning.
No, on Jenny Craig this morning. Eggs, dried or fresh. Cheese. Fruit, if unsweetened or sweetened with saccharin, except bananas and grapes. So look, that's 1951. You may want to modify this a little. How many carbs are okay? 75 to 100. We'll go into this in detail. And next time we'll learn a little bit more about fructose, metabolic syndrome, all calories not being created equal. Is sugar a nutrient, a toxin, or a drug? And we'll learn about hedonic pathways, pleasure, food, pleasure, and how that all fits into the mess. That's all, folks.
Wow.
Interesting, huh?
Listen with me because Jenny Craig, the thing will have pasta, and they give you, there's lots of pasta on Jenny Craig.
Lots of pasta on Jenny Craig. Look, the truth is if you cut the total calories, you can lose weight, but you're fighting your hormones. It's not the way to do it. Just like those oophorectomized rats, you can limit the calories, and you can, to some degree, limit weight gain, but your body may be stealing energy from your muscle, probably is, taking it from your muscle. So if you're maintaining weight loss, you might be losing more muscle, gaining more fat, and taking it from vital organs. You know, remember, if it triggers insulin, it's a fat trap. It's semi-starvation. Those calories go to your fat, and you may be digesting muscle and, you know,
And I'm never,
and you're never full. That's the key, that you're on the wrong diet, because insulin levels are still high in you. That's what makes you fat, keeps you fat, makes you hungry. Remember, insulin makes you hungry. Let me see if I have any questions online. Hello, anybody online have any questions? I guess not. Okay, so we're good, guys. Thank you very much.
well, thank you.
You're welcome. A pleasure.
I can't believe, every time I tell my Jenny Craig lady, I said, you know, I know